Why did the first movie ever made show a woman harvesting babies from a garden? I want to start with something small, something so easy to dismiss that most people who encounter it do exactly that. They read the description, they note it as curious, and they move on. I didn't move on. The first narrative film ever recorded in human history, the first time a camera was pointed at actors telling a deliberate story, is about a fairy pulling babies out of a garden. Not a love story, not a war, not a hero's journey or a comedy or a portrait of ordinary life. Babies, harvested from the earth like vegetables, placed on the ground like produce. That's the story humanity chose first. And the deeper I looked into why, the more that small, curious fact became something I couldn't account for with any comfortable explanation. Let me tell you who made it. Her name was Alice Guy. She was 22 years old in 1896, working as a secretary for a camera manufacturing company in Paris called Gaumont. Her employer, Léon Gaumont, was focused entirely on selling equipment. The camera was the product. What you did with the camera was, in his view, beside the point. Alice disagreed. She asked permission to use the equipment to make something. Gaumont agreed, on the condition that it not interfere with her secretarial duties. She made Le Fée aux Choux, the cabbage fairy, in the spring of 1896. It ran for approximately 1 minute. A woman in a theatrical costume moves through a painted garden set, reaches into oversized cabbages, and produces living infants one by one, setting them on the ground with the casual efficiency of someone unloading a delivery. The film no longer exists. Like 90% of everything made before 1929, it is gone. We have a description, a few production photographs, and a reconstruction she made herself years later when someone finally thought to ask. But the original minute of footage, the actual first narrative film, has vanished, as if someone decided it didn't need to be kept. Here is what troubles me about that. We preserved the second film. We preserved the third. We preserved fragments of dozens of films from the same period, including other films Alice herself made. The one that didn't survive is the first one, the one that shows the origin of the story. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. But before the film, there was something else. Something Alice saw that nobody in the standard history of cinema mentions. Approximately 2 months before she made that film, she walked past a storefront on Boulevard Poissonnière in Paris. The windows were lit from inside. She went in. What she found was rows of glass and metal boxes, and inside those boxes, premature human infants, living, breathing, some small enough to fit in a man's open hand. They were lying in machines modeled after equipment used to hatch chicken eggs, because that is precisely what the inventor had based them on. A French engineer named Alexandre Lyon had patented the device in 1889. He had no hospital backing. No medical institution would support him. So, he funded the work by charging Parisians admission to come watch the smallest human beings they had ever seen fight to survive. 50,000 people paid to see them in the first year. Alice Guy was one of them. Her granddaughter confirmed it. She walked into a room where babies were displayed in glass boxes for the entertainment and curiosity of strangers, and then she went and made a film about a woman pulling babies from a garden. This raises a simple but critical question. What exactly was she processing? The official explanation is that she was drawing on French folklore, and the folklore is real. In France, the tradition held that boys came from cabbage patches and girls from rose bushes. Parents told children this the way parents elsewhere told children about storks. It was charming. It was harmless. It was the kind of thing you pass down without thinking about why you started, saying it in the first place. But folklore doesn't exist in a vacuum. Folklore is what a culture reaches for when it needs to explain something it cannot say plainly. And in 1896, France had a great deal. It could not say plainly about where certain children came from. Let me give you the number that reframes everything. 100,000. That is the approximate number of infants abandoned annually across Europe at the height of the foundling system. Not scattered cases, not tragic exceptions. 100,000 children per year deposited into institutional care, in many cases anonymously and permanently, by parents who could not feed them, or did not want them, or had no choice in the matter. In France, Italy, and Spain, as many as 1 in 3 babies born in urban areas entered these institutions rather than a family home. 1 in 3. And the mechanism by which this happened was so normalized, so architecturally embedded into the fabric of daily life, that it had its own piece of furniture, the foundling wheel. The Italians called it the ruota. It was a rotating wooden cylinder built into the exterior wall of a hospital or church. A woman could place her infant inside, turn the wheel, ring a bell, and walk away. The staff on the other side would rotate the cylinder to receive the child. No name required, no explanation requested, no record of the mother. The first one was installed in Rome in 1198. By the 14th century, they had spread across Catholic Europe. By the early 1800s, France had 251 of them, legalized by formal decree on January 19, 1811. Not tolerated, legalized, standardized, given official status as the proper way to process children whose existence was inconvenient or impossible. The death rate inside the foundling hospitals these children entered averaged 80%. In some years and some institutions, it approached 100. The children who survived were renamed. In Italy, they were called esposito, meaning exposed. In France, trouvé, found. Their origins were not obscured accidentally. The system was designed to make origin irretrievable. The official explanation for all of this is poverty and desperation. And that explanation is not wrong. But it doesn't account for the scale. It doesn't account for the coordination. It doesn't account for the fact that this system ran for over 6 centuries across multiple nations and multiple languages, and produced at its peak a world in which the most common answer to the question of where a baby came from was not a mother and a father, but an institution, a wheel in a wall, a cabinet of strangers. And then in 1854, the American version began. A train left New York City on September 20th carrying 46 children. They ranged from infants to 12 years old. No parents accompanied them. When they arrived in Dowagiac, Michigan, they were lined up on the platform of the railroad station. Local families walked past, inspected them, and selected which ones they wanted to take home. The first agent running the program let passengers adopt boys on the spot without checking references. He described girls as useful for housework. Many of the children placed this way were used strictly as farm labor. And here is the part that the standard history tends to minimize. Many of them were not orphans. They were children of immigrants, of the poor, of families that had been told, sometimes forcibly, that the system would care for their children better than they could. The children traveled for days with 2 or 3 adult supervisors to every 30 or 40 of them. They arrived with no birth certificates, no verifiable identity, no provable history. The program ran until 1929. By the time the last train departed, somewhere between 200,000 and 250,000 children had been transported this way. 2 million of their descendants are alive today. Many still cannot trace their lineage past a railroad platform. The cabbage patch. That's the answer the culture offered. Not literally, but functionally. You don't tell a child their sibling was placed in a rotating wooden box in a church wall by a woman who couldn't afford another mouth. You tell them babies come from gardens. You don't tell a community that 250,000 children were stripped of their identities and shipped across a continent for selection by strangers. You send them a postcard of a cherubic infant nestled in green leaves, tended by a kindly fairy. The mythology doesn't replace the truth. It covers it. And the covering is so complete that after a generation or two, most people forget there was anything underneath. The postcards began circulating around 1900 and continued through approximately 1920. Hundreds of thousands of them, produced across Germany, France, Russia, Spain, Britain, and the United States. Multiple studios, multiple languages, no single coordinating source anyone has identified. Art historians classify them as birth announcements, sentimental folklore, harmless whimsy, and some of them are exactly that. But some of them are not. Some of them show couples browsing rows of infants the way a shopper browses produce. Some reference lotteries. Some show gardeners tending fields of babies with the detached efficiency of agricultural workers. The imagery is not uniformly tender. Some of it is plainly transactional. Babies as things that are grown and selected and distributed. And the fact that this imagery flooded the Western world during the exact decades when the orphan trains were running at peak volume, when the foundling system was only recently closing its wheels when premature infants were being exhibited in glass boxes at amusement parks for paying crowds. That fact sits in the historical record without explanation. The silence was deafening. I want to stay with the incubators for a moment, because they represent something the standard narrative of medical progress does not fully account for. Alexandre Léon, the man whose exhibition Alice Guy visited before making the first film, was never formally recognized by the medical establishment. His credentials were disputed. The mainstream medical profession of his era did not see premature infant survival as a priority worth pursuing. A prominent Chicago physician produced a film in the early 1900s advocating for letting premature infants die, arguing that saving them would damage the genetic stock of future generations. The Boston medical press questioned whether the effort was worthwhile. In this environment, the only functional path to saving a premature baby was to put it on public display and charge admission. Martin Cooney, who ran incubator exhibitions at Coney Island for 40 years, saved over 6,500 lives this way. His nurse would slide a diamond ring up an infant's arm to the shoulder to demonstrate to the audience how small the babies were. He died without his name appearing in a single medical journal. Alexandre Léon, the man who invented the device, died in 1934. His death certificate listed his occupation as wandering salesman. The men who turned premature infants into exhibition attractions in order to keep them alive were not welcomed into the institutions that eventually adopted their methods. They were erased from the lineage. Their contributions were inherited without acknowledgement. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The pattern repeats. Now I want to bring you forward, because this story did not end in 1929 when the last orphan train departed. It did not end when the foundling wheels were finally closed. It did not end when incubator exhibitions moved from amusement parks to hospital wards. The story changed form. It compressed itself into something that, 80 years after the postcards stopped circulating, 3 million American families would bring into their homes and call their own. In the early 1970s, a Kentucky folk artist named Martha Nelson Thomas began making cloth dolls. Each one was unique. Each one came with a birth certificate and adoption papers. She called them doll babies. In 1976, a 21-year-old art student from Georgia named Xavier Roberts encountered her work at a craft fair. He saw something in it. He began producing his own version after Thomas eventually cut off his access to her designs. He called them Little People and sold them out of a converted medical clinic he renamed Babyland. General Hospital. A licensing agent named Roger Schleifer attached the mythology in 1982. The official story held that Xavier Roberts, as a child, had followed a magical creature behind a waterfall and discovered a garden where babies were born from cabbages. Roberts did not sell the dolls. He adopted them out. Each one came with unique paperwork documenting its birth and its adoption. No parents listed. Born in a garden, distributed through a hospital. Martha Nelson Thomas, the woman who created the original concept, sued. They settled in 1985 for an undisclosed amount. Her name was removed from the product's origin story. The man who commercialized her idea became the face of the invention. The actual creator was absorbed into the background without credit. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Coleco mass-produced them in 1983. 3 million sold before the year ended. 20 million in 1984, $2 billion in retail sales in 2 years. Adults fought each other in department store aisles. There are photographs of injuries, of police called, of lines stretching around city blocks in winter for a doll with no parents, born in a cabbage patch, distributed with official paperwork through a converted hospital. The entire infrastructure of the foundling system and the orphan train and the incubator exhibition compressed into a piece of soft vinyl and polyester fiber given to children as a toy, and absorbed into the culture so completely that nobody asked what the story was actually about. What does it mean that this was the best-selling toy of the 20th century? What does it mean that parents who had never heard of the Ruota, who had no idea the orphan trains had ever run, who knew nothing of the Boulevard Poissonnière or the first film ever made, nevertheless stood in lines and threw elbows and handed over $60 to adopt a doll born from a cabbage? What does it mean that the mythology reached them, that it always reaches people, that it keeps finding new containers? Here is what I think. I think a civilization needs a story for the things it cannot say plainly. I think when a system processes children at industrial scale, when it strips them of identity and origin and places them into the hands of strangers through institutions built for the purpose, the culture that runs that system builds a mythology to stand in front of it, not to justify it, not even necessarily to hide it, but to make it feel like something other than what it is, to give it the texture of magic instead of the texture of machinery. The fairy in the garden does not arrive by accident. She arrives because someone needs her there. She arrives because the alternative, saying plainly that we built wheels in church walls to receive babies anonymously, that we put them on trains and lined them up on platforms for selection, that we displayed them in glass boxes at amusement parks, is something the culture cannot hold without the mythology wrapped around it. Alice Guy walked into a room full of babies in glass boxes and made a film about a fairy harvesting children from a garden. That film is gone now. The first story cinema ever told vanished. What remains is the pattern it was part of. 800 years of foundling wheels and orphan trains and incubator exhibitions and postcard babies and Cabbage Patch Kids, all using the same image, all telling the same story, all doing the same work. Babies without parents, born from the earth, selected, distributed, adopted. I keep returning to a single question, and I don't have a clean answer to it. And I'm not sure one exists. What story does a civilization tell itself when the truth of what it does with certain children is too large and too systematic to say out loud? What mythology does it reach for when the machinery is too visible to hide entirely? And what does it mean that the story it reached for, the story it has been reaching for 8 centuries across, 6 continents, and every language it speaks, is always the same story? A garden, a fairy, a baby with no origin anyone has to account for. A child you can take home without asking where it came from. The foundling wheels are still there. You can find them built into the walls of old hospitals in Rome and Florence and Milan. The adoption papers from the orphan trains are in genealogical archives. The postcards are in museum collections. The Cabbage Patch Kids are in attics across America, each one still carrying its paperwork inside the box. And the first film ever made is gone. Which means the question of exactly what Alice Guy understood when she pointed a camera at a fairy pulling babies from a garden is one we can never quite answer. But the story is still telling itself. It has never stopped. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it.